since the Trinity differentiates between Father, Son, and Spirit, this is a given. But the distinction is in person, not in being, and that will not even appear in this argument. That will not even appear in the argument, which is what causes the problem. Happened was Dale Tuggy, amongst various and sundry other attacks on Twitter and condescending comments, things like that, basically said I shouldn't be taken seriously until I can identify which of these statements are untrue. And there was a link given to an article. Here's where the challenge is laid. So this is what I would identify as sophistry, full-on sophistry. But let's take a look at it. Here's the argument. Number one, God and Jesus differ. Number two, things that differ are two, i.e. are not numerically identical. Three, therefore God and Jesus are two, not numerically identical. For any x and y are the same God only if x and y are not two, i.e. are numerically identical. Therefore God and Jesus are not the same God. Number six, there is only one God. Number seven, therefore either God is not a God or Jesus is not a God. Number eight, therefore Jesus is not a God. So here is your argumentation from Dale Tuggy. Let's walk through this. Number one, God and Jesus differ. Well, immediately, please recognize that the statement assumes the final goal of this argument, the final goal of Unitarianism, by confusing terms. And you will find this with Tuggy all the time. Unitarians demand that God equals the Father, alone, only, always. So if you want to be biblically accurate, if you wanted to be honest with the New Testament, what you would say is the Father and the Son are distinguished from one another. That would be a true statement. But by saying God and Jesus differ, you are importing your conclusions into your argument to begin with. You're not deriving them from the New Testament. And that's what the real problem with philosophers who pretend to do theology is in philosophy, you can spin your argument depending upon the definitional range, semantic range of the propositions that you give. If they couldn't do that, they wouldn't have anything to be doing all day long. They have nothing to be publishing and everything else. So if you're being serious with the Bible, if Scripture is your authority, then you're going to start with the definitions provided here and not some type of philosophical stuff that you come up with from another direction. By the way, if you're wondering, yes, we do know what Dr. Tuggy is talking about, and we'll utilize those sources as our analysis goes on. So, since the Trinity differentiates between Father, Son, and Spirit, this is a given. But the distinction is in person, not in being, and that will not even appear in this argument, which is what causes the problem. So, consider this statement: the Father and the Lord differ. Since kurios is normally used of the Son in the New Testament, and is the Septuagint rendering of Yahweh, the very covenant name of God, would this statement be relevant and lead to a denial that the Father is Yahweh, or God in the fullest sense? Such would be absurd, biblically, of course, but that's the point. Sophistry like this is too simplistic to deal with the breadth and depth of biblical revelation. So always be careful when you run into folks that are using this kind of stuff. Let's press forward. Number two, things which differ are two, i.e. are not numerically identical. Well, insofar as this is stated about the Father and the Son as divine persons, of course, they are not numerically identical as persons, but this is not a denial that the infinite, unlimited being of God cannot be said to be shared fully by the Father and the Son. It doesn't allow for the distinction that is forced upon us by the biblical revelation of one God and then the identification of three persons who are distinguished from one another as that one God. That's why Unitarians have to deny that Jesus identified as Yahweh in the same way as the Father, deny the text on the deity of Christ, and they come up with various ways of doing so, but they're inconsistent in how they do so. And then they fall back on argumentation like this to get around that. Number 3, therefore God and Jesus are two, not numerically identical. And so the correction to this would be the Father and Son are two persons. Basic Trinitarian assertion, basic biblical revelation, contra modalism and oneness. So modalism and oneness do experience confusion at this particular point. So for any x and y are the same God only if x and y are not two, i.e. are numerically identical. This is, again, basic confusion categories. This is an assertion the being of God cannot be shared by two distinct persons. Since the argument isn't allowing that category, then it is smuggling in an assertion illegitimately. No foundation is given for this assertion, nor does this follow from what came before, since what came before does not differentiate between being and person. Hence, this is a false assertion that the Father cannot be identified as Yahweh when the Son is identified as Yahweh as well. That's the biblical reality. And again, if sophistry is not our foundation, but biblical revelation is, then we clearly recognize the error of this kind of thinking, since both the Father and the Son are identified as Yahweh in the New Testament. This is contradicted by clear and compelling biblical evidence, and hence is a false assertion. Likewise, there is confusion with the language same God, since this seems to assume a Unitarian definition of God as well. Again, no distinction between being and person being allowed in that context. Number 5, therefore God and Jesus are not the same God. No, the Father and the Son are not the same person, but the Father and Son are both identified as Yahweh in Scripture, and none of the confusion of categories and hidden Unitarian assumptions provided to this point can change that reality. Number 6, there is only one God. This, of course, should have been the very first statement.
You done messed up, Aaron!
For the Trinity is based upon the biblical reality that 1, there is only one being of God, Yahweh. Number 2, there are 3 distinct persons revealed in Scripture, Father, Son, and Spirit. And 3, these 3 persons are identified as Yahweh and are taught to be equal in power, glory, worship, etc. Basic Trinitarian teaching. Number 7, therefore, either God is not a God or Jesus is not a God. The argument has, of course, already fallen apart, but it is useful to see the foolishness of sophistry when it is applied to scriptural revelation. Since there is only one God, then it follows that since the Father is identified as Yahweh, the Son is identified as Yahweh, and the Spirit is the Spirit of Yahweh, that each are fully divine, yet distinguishable, and the doctrine of the Trinity is true. Again, if biblical revelation was the source of terminology and argumentation, rather than something that you just try to get around. God is a God. That's sort of given. The Father is divine. The Son is divine. The Spirit is divine. The argument, failing to necessarily distinguish between being and person and ignoring biblical revelation, has collapsed into sophistic childishness. Finally, therefore, Jesus is not a God. It is actually embarrassing that so-called philosophers could produce this kind of confusion and such rank error in argumentation. One would think that there would be at least some recognition of the definitional control of biblical revelation and categories, and hence some recognition that Scripture plainly speaks in categories are larger, broader, and deeper than this foolish argument. But, again, if your ultimate authority is, in fact, sophistic argumentation, then you're going to be very impressed by this kind of thing. You shouldn't be, but it should be something that most of us are able to provide a response to. You need to be able to recognize the confusion of categories, the things that are going on in the context of that. So,
hey, it's Trigger. If you like this video, be sure to smash that like button, share it with your friends, and please subscribe. Thank you very much.